very much, Stu. Well, it's great to see so many of you here. This is quite a remarkable turnout. I think it's approaching some of the smaller AGR forum meetings, I think. Yes, welcome to this Archers UK user group meeting. As I think many of you will know, it's not solely for AGRs. We hope to be a welcoming place for anyone based in the UK who's using the Archers platform. We've had a couple of meetings so far, but I think we've been somewhat patchy in our provision. Now that, I think, just before we continue, I know it's not on the agenda, Stu, but I think this is probably the time to sort of say that I think it being chair of this is something that I don't think I'm really sort of bringing my best game to. So I think it's probably about time that I resigned in favour of someone who's who might well be able to give it more attention. And I'm thinking that I'd quite like to nominate Stu for that if he doesn't object horribly. Smile, Stu.
Yeah, that's okay.
That being the case, I mean, there's an awful lot of you here, and only some of you are on the screen. So, does anybody else want the job or want to nominate someone for the job? Looks very much, Stu, very much as though you're in the frame.
Oh,
So
I had all my arguments worked out in case it's going to, go down to a battle.
Well, so I think we can then say that the torch is passed to Stuart Cakebread, Nem Con. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
So,
Thank you.
do you want me to just carry on introducing the agenda for this meeting, or I think you should do it, Stu?
No.
Actually,
This is your last one. Go out with a flourish, Mac. Go out with a flourish.
Last of three. Okie dokie. Well, I think in that case we should probably get straight on into the presentations. Just to sort of say, I think there being so many of us, if we can save questions until after the sort of presentation has finished, and then we can sort of have the presentation and question sessions differentiated for the benefit of the transcript and for people sort of coming in later on. And I think that's probably the best way to arrange it. So after each presentation, we'll have a bit of time for questions. It looks like we've got a good 3-hour session, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for all questions to be asked and answered. So I think let's start off by having the first presentation on the Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia project by Azadeh and Junaid. If you'd like to take it away.
Yes, thanks, Max. And hello to all, and thanks to Stu and Mac for organizing the sessions. So let me just start to share my screen first. Okay, are you seeing my screen? Yes, great. So Junaid and I thought to talk to you today about more the process of our data development and how we prepare data to go into Arches. So not focusing on Arches itself, but kind of the development stage of the process. And just to quickly, for those who don't know our project, just to quickly to introduce our project, and Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia collaborates with local stakeholders in India and Pakistan. And we use different methods, historical maps, legacy data, machine learning, ground truthing, fieldwork survey, and etc., to identify, document, and disseminate archaeology and heritage, cultural heritage of the Indus Valley Basin and the surrounding areas. And the main reason that we're doing this, as many of the other Arcadia projects using Arches, is because the heritage and archaeology of this region is at risk of increased agricultural and urban expansion in the last 50, 60 years. And this is an example that you can see from a mound settlement sites that is identified both in the legacy data, existing publications, and also it's it's also documented on historical maps, but half of the sites has been leveled, and this has been happening to a lot of these sites. And one of the kind of the main aim of the project is to document these sites and make them available in ARCH's platform to other heritage professionals, researchers, and public with specific access requirements to have access to this data. Okay. We are using different sources. Our data, the data that comes to we're using for the project, it comes from different sources. And from the beginning, we started to think about this different data and all the attributes that we have with all this data and understand how to better design ARCH's database. So quickly to introduce the different sources of data that we're using. One main one for us is historical maps, specifically survey of India maps, and these maps were implemented as part of the British colonial interest in the region, let's say, and this maps documents features on the landscapes in different scales, 1 inch to 1 mile, and also 1 inch to 2 and to 4 miles. But the 1 inch to 1 mile map series were based on topographic surveys from the late mid-19th centuries onwards, and the resulting maps were produced from the first half of the 20th centuries. And map of this series, specifically the 1 to 1 inch map, they're very useful from remote sensing, and they were created using systematic in a large scale, let's say, and doing a systematic sale, and contains many details of features that they are important for us as archaeologists, and there are also archaeological sites that are also documented on these maps. And one feature, other than features like mosques or temples or more like heritage features that mark on the maps, there are also different iconography that's used to document elevated grounds or mounds on these maps. And we're using, and based on the different previous studies that were undertaken by our collaborators in India and also the Cambridge researchers, it was identified that a lot of these mounds features from these maps are archaeology. And in this kind of two small screenshots that I have here, these are the two different mounds that we can find from these maps. The assured mounds and the form line mounds, that sometimes they might have also other indications like crosses for abandoned settlements or the temples that they're identified on top of these mounds. So one kind of the source of data that we use a lot are the maps, and we're also using remote sensing, today satellite imagery, to see whether the mounds already exist by looking at the imagery, or like this one, they're leveled. And another kind of the big source of information for us are the legacy data or existing published data. And these sites are coming either from different books or published survey reports, PhD and master's thesis, and they're been documented in different hard or soft copies and in different formats. And we have them mostly compiled in from, again, the previous projects before MAHSA started in, I'm trying to remember, what was, Junaid, can you remind me the name of the database that was used? It's, maybe you're not here. Junaid?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, which, the Arcane database?
The previous, no, our
data,
FileMaker Pro, sorry, yes, FileMaker Pro, the name was kind of skipping my head. So the data was kind of compiled in the FileMaker Pro, and then it was the first stage of the cleaning that Junaid started with the project. We ended up with more or less around 10,000 sites that now we have to enhance and clean before pushing into ARCHs. Then we are using machine learning and a trained to automatically detect these mounds from the maps. And with the first kind of series of this type of detection, a trained model was applied over an area of 470,500 square kilometers. And we have now around 6,000 mounds identified by these maps. Again, we don't know if there are archaeology or non-archaeology, but kind of as a data that comes, let's say, from these maps, we have now around 6,000 mounds for now, and they're going to increase, that we need to also study and include in the database. Then we have a field survey component that when we work very closely with our collaborators in both India and Pakistan, based on the both legacy data that we have and the mounds that are identified by the maps. Our collaborators identify different areas for field survey and identify the features that they're interested to go and see in the field, whether there are archaeology or not. And if there are, to add any more information that they can from the field to these sites. So when we were thinking about modeling these data into arches, we were having kind of this sources first that we wanted to be able to capture and include in the database. And with that, we decided to make two different resource models for our data sources. One is the information resource model that comes with Arch's database, but we modified it to meet our purpose, kind of based on the information that we want to record from our sources. And these are everything from books, articles, videos, photographs, so anything that we use as a source to find, to record archaeology from. But because we're kind of, one of our main source is historical maps, and we're recording a lot of metadata for these maps, and not just the things that they're more interested and important on archaeology side, but on the history side of the maps as well. We decided that we need to have this separate resource model for historical maps as well. Then for our from the archaeology heritage sites, we decided to have two resource models. One is the one that we call heritage location, and that's mainly for most of the sites that we're or heritage features that we're recording in the database. But because we're also dealing with a few very complex sites, whether they're serial sites or very large sites that are in two different districts or provinces of one country, we wanted to kind of have this separate kind of the area, heritage area resource model to be able to deal with the more complex sites. And then, of course, what is the activity that this data is coming from? So if we're doing remote sensing or field survey, these are recorded in our activity resource models. And then we have a few more for the grids and person and organizations that Junaid can show you if you're more interested in seeing our different resource models. For the database objectives, kind of the Arch's end result objectives, we wanted, of course, to address this key issue of data accessibility. We had all this data living in different closed either databases as a data sets or on like a hard copy ones, published but hard copy. So far, kind of our main aim was to make this data accessible. But then we had to deal also with the issue of the compiling clean data and dealing with the inconsistencies and imprecisions and duplications. As you can see from this is just a few examples, but we have many and many of these examples that one site in the existing format of the GIS layer that we have, they have multiple locations. We have multiple locations from one site, or a site might have different names. So we wanted to, before pushing things into Arches, make sure that we clean and enhance data. And that was the stage that we started to think about, so how we can do this. We wanted to be able to visually analyze this data. So we had to use GIS, and we want everything to be our partners and collaborators in both India and Pakistan be able to use freely. So we're relying on open softwares. So we're using Quantum GIS. And we wanted to streamline this process of cleaning, enhancing data in a GIS environment, and also not to duplicate our work. So we thought from the beginning to use maybe a GeoPackage format, but then moved into using a more database that Junaid is going to talk about as an interim phase to be to our different research associates and be able to use at the same time, same database, clean data, be able to do this analysis in a GIS platform, and then push everything, the clean, as much as we can do, the clean and enhanced data into Arches. And this is where I'm going to hand over to Junaid to continue and explain this data development process and data life cycle. Junaid, would you like me to continue and go forward, or you want me to come out and you share your screen?
Yeah, yeah, I can share my screen if that's okay.
Okay, so let me just. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So you can see the screen now.
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, as Azadeh has talked about the different steps of the data development that we are having at the MAHSA project. So over here, I will talk about the different data development tools that we are using to digitize the data, to manage it, and then import it into Arches. So on the top row, this is the diagram that we are using for data lifecycle for the MAHSA project. So on the top row, you can see the summary of the sources that Azadeh has already discussed. That we are using historical maps, a collection of legacy data, then remote sensing, Google Earth images, corona imagery, hexagon imagery, then data is coming from machine learning and digital field surveys using the ODK app. So all those data challenges that Azadeh has mentioned, we are dealing with a quite complex data set in terms of the duplication of the data and also the locational variability. For example, in some of the data sources and some of the site locations, there are up to 4, 5, or 6 different locations that are coming from different legacy data sources, which really presented the need of visualizing this data into a GIS environment, which is QGIS for us, and to create that link between the spatial and non-spatial attributes so that the team could develop the data in an organized way, which can be eventually imported into Arches. So over here, you see two parts. One is the centralized data development, and the second is the decentralized data development. First, I will talk about the centralized Postgres setup that we have. So this setup was mainly developed and put in place to handle all of those requirements of handling the data duplication issues, working in QGIS to cater for the locational variability, do the different types of data analysis using satellite imagery as base maps. So this centralized database can be connected to QGIS, and we have made a data entry form that I will talk about in the next slide to enter data into the centralized database. However, at the same time, we cannot totally get rid of the decentralized data development because we have collaborators in Pakistan and India. And we also have a maritime branch of the project. So in that domain, we have data submissions coming from the digital field surveys using the ODK application. And then there are also structured CSV files that basically depict the bulk import templates as mentioned in the Arches documentation. We are not using the relational geo package extensively at the time, but this is mentioned over here as a possibility for future. The rest of the data is managed onto the SharePoint, and we have quality assurance and formatting checkpoints between our collaborators and MAHSA team. So different team members from the MAHSA team are responsible for different regions across the project area, and the collaborators within their respective area submit the data to the respective team member from MAHSA, who make sure that it's correct in format and quality, performs a quality assurance, and from there it becomes a part of one centralized Postgres database, which from where it's pulled into Arches in an automated and scheduled pipeline that I'll talk about in the next few slides. So this is the interface of the form that you can see that we are using to enter data into the centralized database. I would like to thank the CAL project and especially Marco, who was very kind enough to have a number of sessions with us in the beginning to share their work about the this geo package and QGIS data entry form. This form has a number of features implemented in it, like it ensures that the MAHSA IDs remain unique so that there is no duplication and the data imports fine in ARCHIS. Then handling one-to-many relationships, like all those branches that are configured to allow multiples in ARCHIS are handled using the one-to-many relationships in different cards, as you can see on the top of this interface, like assessment activity, site name, heritage summary. Then we have the drop downs for control vocabularies. And on the left-hand side, we have just, because there are a number of tables due to the complexity of the resource model, but we have we have marked the other tables as hidden so that they don't confuse the data digitizing team. And you can only see the heritage location layer. Then the point and the geometry layers had to be kept within the project so that it can be visualized on the map part of the QGIS. In this screen, you can see that one heritage location can have more than one assessment activities. So over here, you can enable start editing for the assessment activity and start adding more than one assessment activity using the one-to-many relationship. Here is an example on the for the concepts drop down. We have added the control vocabularies from our thesaurus into this form. And over here, you can see that assessment type is a concept list, so you can select multiple values from the data entry form. So the next step, when you have data into the centralized DB, the next step is really to import this into ARCHIS. And some from the very beginning, because of the project requirement, we had a bit complex resource model with nested multiples. So we were having challenges with importing this data using the CSV file. So if you look at the example of one example of this nested multiple is that one heritage location resource can have multiple condition assessments, and then one condition assessment can have multiple disturbance or damage states or risk assessments. So this was increasing the number of nested multiples and giving us challenges in terms of data import using the CSV file. So we discussed this with the different projects, how they were handling. Some had custom solutions in place. And then in discussion with Farallon, we came to know about that there is a relational schema functionality of ARCHIS that will be rolled out with ARCHIS 7, and that would allow you to just deal with your data in terms of relational views. So we have extensively worked on that to be able to import our data into ARCHIS. So what this functionality does is that it basically creates relational schema for your resource model. So over here, you can see that there is a function ARCHIS create resource model views. You pass it the relevant graph ID. For example, this is the graph ID for our heritage location resource model. It gives you a success statement. And on the left-hand side, you can see that it has created relational views for all the branches in your resource model. Now it gives you a lot more control of your data, how you do the parent-child hierarchy to import your data in the right way. And at the bottom, at the right, you can see that the individual columns that within these views, like you have to populate the tile ID, then populate the actual address direction string, then the concept for address direction type, then the resource instance ID, and so on. So you have to basically write the actual SQL queries to pull the data, to insert data into these relational views. What we have done is that our centralized database is accessible from within the ARCHIS backend Postgres using the foreign wrappers functionality of Postgres. So what I'm doing is that we are directly accessing our centralized database from Postgres, from ARCHIS backend Postgres. The queries to insert the data would look something like this. So over here, you can see the example of importing the name data for name branch. So over here, it's because in the ARCHIS backend, we need the UUIDs for concepts rather than the exact concept. For example, if the name term is primary, you need to replace it with the unique universal ID from the thesaurus. So which statements allow you to create a lookup table just for the scope of that query, which replaces your concepts with the relevant UUIDs. And then you write the rest of the query for importing tile IDs, name types, name, and the resource instance. One thing that is important with the ARCHIS 7 release is that the data types for Postgres columns has been changed to JSON, the JSONB. to be able to cater for multilingual strings in the same cell. So over here, you need to convert that value of your name into a JSON object, as you can see in the line number 21. Just as I mentioned about the concept column, similarly, there is also you can also have concept lists within your resource model. So when we were working with it, we noticed that there is no in the documentation available and the functions that are available in the documentation for this relational schema, we don't have the provision of importing the concept list data. So we were talking with different developers with Farallon, and so we have written our own custom function that expects the data in this format, like just a standard concept list that, for example, at the bottom, you can see further bibliographical research, ground truthing, location accuracy, different concepts in a concept list. This would go input into this custom function that we have written, and it generates an array of UUIDs that is acceptable for Arch's relational views. So we are happy to share with any other project that wants to make use of it. But yeah, I have also shared it with the Farallon contact person that was discussing it, so it might become a part of the documentation eventually. So some of the challenges. So yeah, after doing this import into the relational views, you just have to run the indexing command, and your data would be readily available into Arches. Some of the challenges that we had while working this pipeline out is that the documentation for there is limited documentation available for different Archie data types, and how they would go into the JSON into the Postgres JSON binary structure. For example, we had to insert, for some cases like the URL node, we had to insert the data directly from the Arches interface and then go to the backend and see how it would look in the relational view, and then write our SQL query according to it. Then similarly for the EDTF and then the concept list function that I mentioned. So these were the things that took some time to sort out. Currently, I have posted this on the forum as well, that there is a challenge of handling null geometry. So what is happening at the moment is, if you have null geometry inserted into the relational view, there is an automated function that is called to create the tiles from these relational views, and that creates a null GeoJSON object, whereas it should not create any object in the first instance. So there is a way around that has been suggested to me on the forum, and we will enhance our workflow according to that. And then there is also a challenge of checking for null string values, because what happens is that when you're building the JSON object, it would create an empty JSON object if there is no value for the string. So we have to be very careful about these checks in our SQL queries, that we are not creating any empty JSON objects that are just using up the database space. Yeah, so on the next slide, there is another challenge mentioned that I would hand over to Azadeh, and have to answer any question at the end. Thank you.
You can, Junaid, go to. Yes, please. Thanks, Junaid. So just two last things that we wanted to talk and see if any projects here at this meeting they've used or facing the same issues, and we can discuss furthermore. Is one, the use of provisional data in Arches. And we're interested to see if there are any other projects that they've been using actively this provisional data, because for now, for us, we haven't explored that much, but what we can tell is when those nodes have data in them, then it becomes difficult to flag them as provisional, let's say. And the reason kind of we want to use it is, as I showed you in the first slide, is a component of our data will come and is coming now from machine learning. And these are the, for now, around 6,000, but we're going to have more and more sites coming from the maps and reading these, from the machine learning reading these maps. And we know that we're not going to have time to go over all this. Say we have already 10,000 legacy data that we need to cross-check against everything other from remote sensing and maps that we can find, and we cannot clean and this work needs also the field work aspect, to go to the field and really see if there these mounds, if there exist today, whether there are archaeology or not. But at the same time, we want to push it into Arches. We don't want to leave it out. So kind of the question of whether provisional data would be a good route to use for this type of data, or making another remote resource model and just use it as an external layer on top of everything. So that's one thing that we're now in the process of thinking, and if there's anyone here in the room that can help us with or have used this would help. Do you want to go to the next one, Junaid? And the next kind of question that we have is, we know that Arches has this now capability of editing data and they're with ArcGIS. So there are projects using Esri to kind of edit data into Arches. Since we're using QGIS, Quantum GIS, we kind of interested also to see if there are other projects that are interested in doing same thing of editing kind of live in directly from Quantum GIS and into Arches, and this, if that's something that we can join as different projects or groups, so we can also develop this for if we can explore the ways of developing this for Arches. So it's kind of the interest to see how the Esri one works with Arches, and then how we can do this with QGIS. I think these are the two main things, Junaid. No, yes, great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, no, thank you both for that presentation. It's a remarkable example of using Arches on such a large scale and with such a volume of data, and the machine learning aspect is something that I think is going to be very interesting in the future. I noticed that that Susan has commented that the QGIS link is something that she would be interested in as well. But I think probably now, if I open the floor to questions and observations.
I think just for me, you were talking about some of the machine learning work that you did. Was your machine learning work done outside of Arches? Was it done on data that was kind of prior to loading, that had kind of informed the data loading, or was it something that you had worked on based upon data within Arches itself?
Go ahead, Junaid.
Yeah, no, so it's outside Arches and it's based on the historical maps basically. So the historical maps gets your reference, and then they're fed into a machine learning algorithm that detects the mount sites and creates a layer for them, and from there it's processed and imported into Arches.
This is purely based on the iconography of the mount features from the maps, and kind of the previous ground truthing exercise that were done with our different organizations in Cambridge and India, and going to these sites, mounts featured, let's say, sites, and finding that some of them are archaeology and they really exist now, and they're archaeology. So it's kind of prompted this idea of us. And now one of our colleagues today in India found one of these mounts being archaeology as well. So we're kind of documenting all of them without knowing if they're either natural or archaeology or non-archaeology, and if they're today they exist or not. So it's not the remote sensing aspect with satellite imagery even. That's the part that we do before going to the field manually. But everything for now is outside of Arches. So, but we just have this data back kind of to understand how we deal with this in the processing stage.
If no one, there's no one else, I was going to ask another question or kind of say another thing. I mean, you mentioned about provisional editing at the end there on how you're kind of dealing with that with your machine learning. I think using the provisional editing would be a good thing. I guess it's just a question about overhead on how many features and data you're going to be kind of running through machine learning and then having to kind of come back to later, because you'll have to review it and unprovisionally change, edit it. I mean, I've been looking at using some kind of generative AI stuff for building kind of descriptions of structured data, kind of natural language stuff, and I would probably go around the same route as you and use the provisional editing kind of part of it to kind of capture those initial natural language kind of translations, and then ask a sensible human being to then go and check and make sure it actually makes sense. So I would agree that was the right way to do it.
Oh, Okay, great. But have you explored and using that really in Arches and see how it works, this provisional data?
I mean, we have used it. I think it's just a case of rather than importing your data directly into the tile data field, there's like a provisional data field that you kind of write exactly the same value into, and it just, I believe it picks up the fact that you've given it provisional data, and it will then give you that. Yeah. I guess the question is, if you do that directly in the database, whether it gets picked up in things like Elasticsearch for kind of flagging in the UI. So that's the only thing I would question.
Thank you.
Okay. So are there any other questions for Azadeh and Junaid? No? Okay, if you do as we're sort of going on, and I can see that Phil's put a comment in the chat as well. If you do think of any further questions as we go on, I think we can probably have a little bit of a roundup session at the end to pick up any questions like that. So, well, thank you again for that presentation. Fascinating stuff. And now we'll move on to John Murphy's presentation on digital transformation work from the Historic Environment Division, Northern Ireland. Over to you, John.
Hello. Let me just see if I can share my screen here first. So can you all see that? Hope you can. Yep. Okay. All right. So yeah, my name is John Murphy. I'll be doing the quick intro bit, and the interesting stuff will be coming from my colleagues Jana and Phil from Flax and Teal, who've been doing most of the work, most of the good work for us. But basically, just to give you a bit of background to this, so there's Northern Ireland there. We've got a devolved assembly here where we at least nominally have sometimes whenever politicians can stop arguing with each other. And one of the things that's been devolved is obviously the management of heritage. It's falls under the Department for Communities there, which is where I work. In Northern Ireland, I suppose differently to the way it would be in the likes of England and Scotland and Wales, most of the functions with regards to heritage management are centralised within the Historic Environment Division. So that goes to managing the historic environment record, managing scheduled monuments, listing of historic buildings, managing properties, etc., etc., etc. And as a consequence of that, I think there's been no real need for us to have to kind of synchronize our procedures and our processes with anybody other than ourselves, really. That's kind of put us in a somewhat interesting position. Now, I don't think we're particularly unique in that regard, but it has had some consequences for how we go about managing our records. So we've got like I said, we've got the historic environment record in Northern Ireland here, because of the way that the kind of processes and heritage management practices are managed here, essentially the asset registers we have, the heritage asset registers we have evolved within the context of those processes as much as they have within as much as they have from a kind of a thematic point of view. So we've got a sites and monuments record still, we've got a historic buildings record still, we've got an industrial heritage record, and they all evolved from various surveys in the 40s, 50s and 60s mainly. And the processes that go with these, so scheduling of monuments and listing of historic buildings, and the management of kind of marine heritage assets have kind of, for a long while, they kind of sat neatly within this context whereby we've got this massive information fairly broadly spread, and it's been okay because of the fact that we're just the one organization. So from that point of view, we've kind of, the record is just evolved from the old paper maps that we had for the Sites and Monuments record through to the kind of more recent GIS-based like web interfaces that we have, and to allow us and anybody who's interested or has a need to know, they can get access to the information. But fundamentally, though, the kind of, as you can see from the list down the right-hand side, our records are still very disentangled from each other. They're still very separate, and that has caused us problems in the past. Most particularly from the point of view of the fact that some of these records aren't very well. They aren't very well enriched. So we've got certain bits of information in some records. We've got slightly more in other records. Some are held on GIS databases. Some are held in SQL databases that are made publicly available in some cases. In some cases, they're not made publicly available other than kind of fairly superficially. And as well, because of this fact that we tend to have things recorded multiple times, which is really starting to become a big problem. So I've given an example here of a landscape in South Belfast. You've got the River Lagan there running through the middle of the map that you can see, and the kind of shaded green area there is Beaver Forest Park, which is a design landscape from the 19th century, I think, the 18th century, I can't remember. But obviously there, as you can see in the pop-up there, there's an ice house that's recorded on the listed buildings register with some limited bits of information. But the same thing is recorded on the industrial heritage record there as a blue dot. Now, when that's presented to somebody spatially on a map, they can, if they have their wits about them, they can put 2 and 2 together and say, right, well, those dots aren't particularly far apart, but fundamentally that's the same record. And if somebody is using the industrial heritage record to do any kind of research, they need to be aware of the context of the fact that there may be information related to any site that's on that record held somewhere else. And that goes for everything. So obviously the design landscape there contains a scheduled area highlighted in red. That's a wrath, I think, or maybe a motte. It's the kind of the curvilinear red area there is a part of the Lagan navigation, which is a canal. The purple dots either end of that canal are boundary posts that are recorded on a different record. So it's very disjointed, and it means that any attempt at kind of interpreting the landscape or any of the kind of processes that we need to do for heritage management need to be very involved, and they need people who have a kind of an understanding of the various nuances and the issues here, which isn't very accessible, frankly. It's started to become a real problem. So from that point of view, what we over the last kind of 5 years or so, we realized that we need to start thinking about how we go about dealing with this. And so in 2019, we initiated a discovery exercise with some of our colleagues in the Department of Finance, and identified a set of kind of key criteria. And on the back of that, in 2022? It was last year. Yeah, it was last year. We went out and procured Flax and Teal, who have come in to start working on us to try and help us develop an ArchES instance. So I will now hand over to my colleagues Jana and Phil, who'll tell you about all the brilliant things they're doing to fix all our problems.
Thank you. I genuinely hope everybody can hear me. Yes, that's a first success of today. Thank you, John. So as John said, we are doing the digital transformation of several different platforms actually onto one that has been either buildings or historical heritage assets, but also gardens and all the sorts of historical data that we are working with. To be fair, it's exceptionally interesting and challenging at the same time, but all in very good ways. We held several workshops for HED, so we could understand their needs as well as they could understand what are the the options of the platform and what the platform can actually do for them. So that was all incredibly helpful, just in terms of communication and clear understanding to each other, which I think is always a key when you're doing something like this. It's a large data transfer. So that was phase one. We're slowly entering the phase two, in which we're going to be more talking and concentrating on workflows, but I'll leave that for now. In terms of arches and what they're doing for us and what we're doing within this, Historical England has been great help for us as well, because they're users and they're using it for a very long time. Phil Carlisle has been a great help, but also the Arches forum. Again, great source of information. If you have a question, fire it there. There's always someone there at hand to help. If I want to highlight some specific features, there are with the monuments. The first challenge was very often there are several names for one monument, and also there are larger amounts of descriptions. So what's the beauty of Arches is how much it's customizable. So what we've managed to do is keep everything that needs to be kept, because the biggest fear always is to not to lose any data, because nobody wants that, nobody can afford that. So good, Phil very kindly is sharing his screen for me because we have it on joint presentation. But so at the top, you can see all the different names of one single monument. So you can search through any single one of them and it will always come up. Same for the description, all the details from even a couple of decades past, everything is kept there. So that has been, obviously this is not the finished, we're still working on it, but the current interface, what we're looking at and what we're working with, as in we're slowly updating all the data, not feeding all at once, but just testing the platform and seeing how well it's going to take on, and it's been working really well so far. So this would be a monument as a heritage asset, because Arches is built with the historical data in mind. It's been very easy. Well, I say very easy, I'm not a developer, but it's one of the most straightforward ones we've had. So it's fairly smooth. On to the next one. The more challenging bit was the geospatial data. So when it comes to shipwrecks, obviously either coordinates, northing and easting, converting from one to another to be able to pinpoint it into the exact point on the map we needed to. But also when it comes to the land, we had a couple of interesting examples for larger polygons. So I really hope I'm not going to butcher the names, but Grey Abbey Bay, that had about, I believe John said, heads up, it's about 26 different sites on one polygon. But then at the same time, there was Newry Canal, which is just one site, one entry, but it's a very large polygon through the vast area. So that will be, those are our sort of key points of interest, to have it as clear as possible, but also as accurate as possible. Lastly, my personal favorite, because I have a slight librarian background, we were also given all the bibliographic records. Now we needed to structure it, because the way it was, Arches wouldn't be able to really process it. So what we did is create entirely new entry for it, where we structured the data in terms how Arches would be reading it. So we had every single column as a new entry, and then Arches would be able to read it and feed it into its database properly. But also that made mapping really easy, because it was already customized by us to go into Arches. So that was 13,000 entries. It's still work in progress. We're 9,500 deep, I believe. So not much to go, but that was my personal favorite, to be fair, because it's my this is my baby. But it was good exercise. It was good seeing how it's going to read, how it's going to integrate, and how Arches is heavily customizable, which I find personally one of the best things about it. In terms of customization, one good example actually that I don't have a slide for because I wasn't actually sure how would I show it properly just yet, but dates. Dates were one of the biggest challenges, I believe, mostly because of the building data and the second survey. There are several meetings and entries, and we needed to find a way how to preserve all the data. So with the magic of associated records within Arches, I'm saying we are, but hopefully, fingers crossed, it should work. We will be locking together 3 different resource models to connect, to preserve all the data, but also make it nicely connected for not just the staff interface, but also the user interface to see how it's going to nicely connect together, but also it will be very easy to navigate from one to another, and it will be all connected in sense of this is the historic asset, this is the building that has second survey done to it on such and such dates with all the information, but also there is activity associated to it within the meetings that went into the second survey or the building to then approve it for scheduling or updates. So all this spider web together is going to work on the second survey, which is, I think, the second largest data set we were given. So that one was very challenging in terms of connecting everything properly together, but also keeping everything the way it needs to be and to be able to read easily. But with that, I'll also stop rambling and I'll give it over to our Phil Weir, who's going to do more of the technical talk, who actually knows what he's talking about when it comes to Arches in the technical side.
Thanks, Jana. I realized this was listed as 2 separate talks, so I don't know, Stuart, if you wanted to add a thing in between, if you're happy enough for me to carry on, or if there's any questions before I start.
Hello, just to chip in, I'm thinking no, do please, Karen. Although if you want to take questions now, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But I was just going to chip in and say, after you've finished and had some questions, I wonder if the general feeling is we might take a 10-minute break for cups of tea and heading to the loo, and then come back for the rest of the presentations after that. But yeah, if you want to take some questions on the first part of the presentation now, I think that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Sure, sounds sensible.
So I can't. Oh, Matt's got his hand up there.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Jana about the bibliographic data. I noticed the sort of after you'd done the work on it, there was still a column for bibliographic ID and monument ID. So did you manage to come up with a programmatic way of getting rid of duplicates where the same source had been referenced multiple times?
Yes, duplicates. That was one of the slight challenges. So there is no duplicates in terms of individual records. What is happening every now and then is that historically the way it's been done, and John, feel free to jump in anytime. Sometimes there are 2 records on one. So in terms of monuments are all individual, there are no duplicates regards to that, but there are 2 or 3 records tied on one cell or in one entry. So that has been creating a little bit of a trouble, especially when it comes to dates. So that's creating fuzzy dates for us. So we're working around that for now, as in very often you have just a year, as in 1875. And if you plug that into Arches, it automatically jumps to 1st of January. And it's like, no, 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 we just won the year. So that our developers are working around that, specifically Phil and Kanika, who couldn't be here today, but she's a wizard. I have cried on her shoulder many times. But yeah, that is still a challenge.
Cool. Yeah, no, we just had a sort of a distinct problem with our bibliographic records in that anyone who's familiar with HPSMR will know that, you know, it you could only create one bibliographic source, and it would we ended up with something like 3,000 references to every individual volume of Pevsner or the Victoria County histories, and the only thing that was different about it was the page number, depending on what monument it was. So yeah, I had to do that fairly laboriously in OpenRefine, and we then had FME later on down the line. But if anyone ever comes up with a more programmatic way of dealing with that sort of thing, I'm sure any HERs in future wanting to move from HPSMR to Arches of HERs would be really glad to know of it.
I think my biggest advantage working with this bibliography is that I could immediately customize it to Arches. That it wasn't a straight feed, but it's rather me doing it the way I want Arches to read it. So I think that's a huge advantage, to be fair.
Thanks.
No worries.
So does anyone have any other questions before we let Phil carry on? Okay, no. Phil, then do please proceed.
Great, thank you. Let's see if I can share again here at the right page. Okay, hopefully that's visible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some
Wrong
of
screen,
the. Oh,
there you go. No.
No. Hold on, let me try again. Is that you see direction of yep, brilliant. Yep. Thank you. So so I was going to talk a little bit about some of the technical steps we've been taking and some of the direction of travel. Thanks to John and Jana there for the kind of background and context and all the, I would say, all the interesting stuff, but I think it's once you spend too much time in technology, you start to appreciate getting your head out of it for a while. So where we've been working is trying to take a standard approach with some of the modern DevOps processes and get that running with the Arches tooling. So I'm going to go through, I think my idea for how to format this is I'm going to go through a little bit of description verbally and some of the pros and cons. And then if people want to ask questions, I can show a little bit more detail. So I'm not too sure what's of interest to people and what's details that excite only me. So we're currently working with Kubernetes. There's a few reasons for that. And I suppose the main ones are that our actual structure and our code is reproducible and scalable. So once we've got that up and running, if something happens to it, it's relatively straightforward to bring it back up. Data is a slightly separate consideration, but in terms of running lots of processes or the demand increasing, we can respond to that reasonably flexibly rather than having to manually intervene, and setting up things like auto scaling and so forth is a bit simpler than perhaps otherwise. And also all of our infrastructure can be code defined. So I know some people are working with things like Terraform. One of the nice things about Kubernetes is that kind of allows us to go right down to the level of individual Python processes. So to do this, we've also been trying to, especially, you know, our team is quite a variety of experience in the backgrounds, and one of the things we've been quite keen to do, and you'll see a theme through this, is to make it easy for our developers and data folks to work with arches and in ways that are relatively industry standard. So we've got it so that they can push to Git that will create a Docker image that in fact create 2 Docker images. One for wrapping up the Python, and we're doing this on top of an Arches project. We've done that with, you know, create. Oh, sorry, with Create project. Was there a question there? So with Create project, and then we've added in some standard template tools, which we've got in a repo. If you're interested in some more information, I've actually just posted to the Arches forum earlier today about it. And that allows us to build that container in GitHub Actions. And every time one of our devs makes a change and pushes it to CI, then we get those containers rebuilt. We've got some tests that will run, at the moment fairly basic ones, but they'll click through, they'll start up an Arches instance and click through it in the CI and tell us if something doesn't work. And alongside this, once we get our Docker image deployed, one of the things we've been quite keen to do is make sure that we've got not quite, but almost vanilla Docker image for the Arches code base itself. So our image is a relatively thin layer on top of that for our individual project. We can then pull that into our, you know, dev and staging environments with minimal effort. So we can simply say, okay, we're ready for an upgrade here. One thing we're considering doing, for those who are interested, is setting up Argo CD for continuous deployment. But if anyone's interested, please let me know. And one of the other reasons that we're keen on Kubernetes is it does give us a lot of power in terms of things like health checks. So, for example, Kubernetes is smart enough that if we say, okay, we've, you know, there's a new deployment coming, that it will keep the old one running until the new one, the new Python process in Django is started up, is running and has passed health checks, and then and only then it will close down the old one. So in the ideal world, a user could be carrying on using Arches without ever noticing that we've done an upgrade at the back. Okay, so another direction that we've been working on, so that in some ways has been to try and make things a little bit more accessible for the development team, that they're not having to think too much about how Arches is deployed. This side is trying to make it a little bit easier for our data folks, that they're not having to think too much about Arches internals or Arches SQL. And I'm quite interested in a number of the different approaches to this. So I was fascinated by the first talk as well. We're taking a little bit more of approach slightly further down the stack, where we run a Python process with, for anyone who's interested, in Starlet, but it imports the Arches modules in Python and auto-generates an API for us, which is a little bit, maybe a little bit analogous to the views in SQL, but without having to have database access. So, for example, you can, it will work out what the correct endpoints to create are, so that you can write a query to pull back or to create monuments, let's say, or maritime vessels. And because that's using quite a standard system, which GraphQL, we're able to have a fairly thin Arches client that can then reach in. And again, neither of these things needs to know anything about what graphs are available in advance, except we do provide something a little bit analogous to the CSV file that would be used for defining monuments and or defining mappings and import. But none of the code actually needs to know. And then that client can be used in, for example, Jupyter notebooks or in Python scripts to send and receive things from an actual Arches instance. So some of our, we've been quite keen to test this by doing a fairly proof of concept level implementation of it, trying to get the kind of API structure reasonably standardized and then improving from there. And we've relatively recently added the ability to add relationships within a single create and things like that. One design decision that we've tried to make is to minimize as far as possible the appearance of UUIDs. So the GraphQL API will, you can essentially say what the structure you want is and what fields you want and what resources you want to be, or graphs you want exposed, so that a user can simply say, I want to put these 5 fields, a little bit like in the database views. A user can just use an ID with all of the fields that they wish, and it'll work out the structuring into an Arches compatible layout at the back end. So a little bit less, so not really having to expose node IDs or node group IDs to the users. And one of the nice things that we quite like about GraphQL as well is that it's kind of self-documenting machine-to-machine tool. So it gives us a little IDE out of the box where we can actually explore. And if anyone's got a question, I can show that at the end. It comes with a little browser-based IDE where you can kind of click through. And we've a design decision we're considering, but for the moment we've mapped concept lists to lists of enums. So in clear terminology, you'll see an example of that in the center. The actual API itself knows what the options are and can therefore validate when someone sends, let's say, a value for a cross-reference source that's not actually contained within that concept or within that collection. So that's been quite helpful for giving a kind of standardized set of tools for our data scientists to play with without really having to delve into the Arches database for the whole team. And the idea with that is then that we can actually have our data scientists working with things like Jupyter and being able to work with pandas data frames, and then basically push that pandas data frame up to Arches. And there, I suppose, are 2 main benefits for that. At the moment, where we are is really a stability level that works for ingestion. We want to not really thinking about deploying this as a live thing anytime soon, but the hope would be, within the next 6 months to a year. But that it's something that you can use as an alternative way to access Arches data and filter things through user permissions and so forth. And how that works for external, as a hobbyist developer, I got into Arches through open source and open data originally, and I'm quite aware that these kind of tools are fantastic for engagement, and particularly external linking and so forth, alongside things like Sparkle endpoints. So one note about where we're going, there's a few things we've got on the roadmap within the project that John and Jana were talking about, and just more generally in Arches, interest we have, and we're having so it was fortunate to be able to pop over with Jana and Lana and our team to Amsterdam last week, and it was lovely to see some Arches folks there. One of the things that I kind of got chatting a little bit about was how we could maybe improve the experience for permissions management. And one of the things that we're looking at doing is trying to get a bit more flexible user and group system that is a little less surprising. At least that's been my experience. So keen for thoughts on that, and whether people think that's overkill or whether that's useful, but certainly something that we are planning to do. If anyone's familiar with the Caspin system, the hope would be to integrate it with Django Caspin, which is kind of a tool independent and in fact, language independent authorization framework. So you can have permissions that get passed between, that could be shared with external systems or with new APIs or things people want to build as plugins, etc., etc. So I should apologize to John, because this is a fairly recent diagram, so this is rough, but a rough idea of where some of those things that I mentioned are, some of the things we've started off quite early in terms of the infrastructure. So the title of this talk was originally Arches 7 and HER. So one of our first challenges was trying to get Arches HER working on Arches 7. Now, there was very helpfully, and thanks to Cyrus and the Farallon team on the repo, but one of the things we were doing was trying to rebase that on top of the latest changes from the main branch, and that was quite an educational process itself. So we've got that running, and if there are people who would be interested in that, we've got I think a draft PR if it's useful. The next step, I think this is probably the most challenging bit for us, was Webpack. I noticed that's a discussion that's been on the forum last week. So because Webpack and static files, for those who are familiar with the build process, are both present, it's been a little bit fiddly for us as we are deploying our static files and our Python separately. So you can hit the static container 100 times without ever triggering a Python request. But it then means that we've had to rework that quite a bit for Webpack. That's now seemingly so far working, touch wood. But a lot of that early work has been around the infrastructure, and the only other things I haven't really mentioned there are the work on some of the offline mobile workflows. This is something I know has been discussed a couple of times. It's upcoming work, and more general systems integrations. But we are aware that there's some enthusiasm to try and do an end-to-end solution that's come up in previous workshops as well. We'd be very interested in what's happening in that space of offline mobile workflows, but we're also open to, if it's makes more sense, to do some quite specific things with offline workers and progressive web apps, which we found quite useful in the past. But that's something we'd be really interested in being part of the discussion on, because I'm aware a number of people have raised it. So that's essentially where we are. And I guess there's a range of points there that people, I hope, have some questions on and wish to quiz me, and whether or not any of our design decisions make sense. So please feel free to do so, and then I can show off some fancy GraphQL stuff. Hopefully it'll work better than when I was trying to demonstrate it in Amsterdam, and the entire content delivery network that the JavaScript used decided to go down for 20 minutes, which I maintain is entirely not my fault, and as far as I'm aware, it affected everybody around the world on every project unrelated to Arches. But that's my claim, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, thanks very much for that, Phil, and thanks to Jana and John as well. I mean, that's a fascinating insight into the sheer amount of work that needs doing to go from a legacy system to an Arches deployment. And I have to say, John, I feel your pain very much in that regard, although I'm now a good 5 years past that point. So, are there any questions?
Many. Is it the right forum for all of the questions? That's the question. I think for me, you've kind of demonstrated a load of kind of areas that you're taking things forward. Kind of GraphQL, obviously all the Kubernetes work that you talked about already. I guess the question is what's your plan on kind of Archer's project contribution? Because you've got a load of stuff, everyone now wants it. Normally that's one to us, they kind of put something shiny, everyone wants it. Kind of what's your plan for kind of giving this stuff back to the community?
Great question, thank you, and I promise I didn't plant it. So everything we've done, obviously aside from the confidential data that we've been given for obvious reasons, but everything that we're working on is being developed in the open. So we've got repos, they're linked from the Arches forum. That means because we're developing in the open, there is quite a lot of that's alpha code. Some of that's a bit more mature, and obviously since we want to get things stable going ahead of going into production for obvious reasons. But we have been using some components of that now over several Arches projects. One of the things I was just actually messaging about today was it would be good for example, I know there's a few of us who've been talking about a different context, Docker and Kubernetes, are the ways that we could align that. We've got, back about a year ago, I think we did some workshops and things around, okay, what conceptually can we align? But I think actually we're getting to a point where it'd be really useful to try and technically align that, even if we have different kind of stock ways of doing it, if someone comes to Arches and says, hey, I want to set up something that works in Kubernetes, that there's a reasonable starting point. Maybe different people are doing different things, but at least that they've got an idea of what will get them going without having to kind of go back to square one. So yeah, I think for me, how are we going to do that? At the moment, what we've been doing is keeping the stuff updated, trying to basically battle test it by having John tell us when things aren't working. And then I think we're getting to the point where we want to maybe organize another call to go through, okay, here's why we've done these things. Everyone can kind of show and tell, and we kind of say, okay, is there something common here, or do we have all very different needs? But yeah, I'm very keen for feedback on any of that, of course, and any of our code. Please don't be surprised by our alpha level GraphQL code. That's my heads up. Great for ingestion. Sorry.
Sorry, Phil. Just a very quick question. It'll be a short answer. What version of version 7 did you put kind of get Arches HER working with?
7.2.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Said it was going to be a short answer.
Yeah. I've seen there's been discussion over the last week about 7.3, and I haven't. Our last rebase onto the Arches HER main branch was, I think, 2 months ago. So strictly speaking, it's whatever was there then. One of the things that actually hasn't come up, but I think is an interesting side effect of this, is when we started, initially we pulled in Arches HER as it was at the time into Arches 7 to see how we got on. That was back 6 months ago. We hit and started solving some of the problems that we realized were being solved in a branch in in Arches HER. Thanks, folks. So we pulled that in, and then what we realized was that we were switching from we were kind of caught between the difference between monuments and heritage assets. And what we since worked out is that we probably want to be continuing to use heritage assets, even though we understand that, in England, it's going to be a different requirement. So one of the things I'm really interested to see is how we can do that while continuing to pull in updates periodically. And Git is our friend, which is why I have been doing some fun stuff with rebasing that I'm sure you can identify with. But that's one of the reasons, again, like Andy said, if there's anything that we can do to try and save somebody else doing that would be great.
Brilliant. Cheers, Phil.
Okay, any more questions at all? Can't see any hands going up. Hang on.
I was going to say, I think the only thing is Phil, we probably need to get something up on the forum about organising a at least a Kubernetes kind of workshop, but I also think also looking at a slightly more joined up technical roadmap with Farallon, because obviously they're starting to put together a roadmap, and I don't know. We also have a situation where we're trying to kind of keep up as well. So I think starting to work a little bit more holistically and kind of collaboratively in having a joint roadmap.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we've been fortunate to have some, through some of the previous user groups, we'd had a catch up. I think maybe there was a brief workshop about 6 months ago. I think it was with Cyrus, if I recall. And yeah, I was having a chat to Dennis in Amsterdam as well. And I think that's, you know, we are trying to pull in their work, but similarly, it's, as you say, if the roadmaps are aligned, then it makes what we're doing and you know, much more reusable because it's getting pulled back in. Definitely. Cool. Thanks very much.
Okay, no, thank you very much. That was really useful stuff. Shall we take 10 minutes then, for a comfort break, maybe time to make a cup of tea, and be back here for 2:05 or thereabouts? Yeah. Stu, can you pause recording for that?
Yeah, if I could figure out how to do that. I might just have to stop recording. We'll just start another one.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Hope we're all suitably refreshed. So now we're going to carry on with the second set of presentations, and we're going to start with, if I can just get back to my agenda. No, I want to save my changes. Okay, so now we're going to hear from colleagues from Historic England, Matt, Andy, Chantelle, and Paul, about an update on the progress of Archers for HERs, and something that a very important part of the project is the accessibility compliance work, and I'm certainly very keen to hear how they're getting on with that. So over to you guys.
Right, let me just share my screen and make sure I'm on the right screen. Anybody let me know if I'm not on something that looks like a PowerPoint presentation.
Looks good.
Looks good, marvellous. Right, see if I can get that out of the way. Yes, so I'm going to be just speaking from a lowly end user perspective. They'll hopefully be fairly light on technical detail from my side of things. These are just sort of some of the latest changes that's come in the Greater London Historic Environment Records version of Archers for Archers for HERs, locally known as Keystone as our project name. And obviously in the background there, you've got our fancy new front page, which is just one of the latest and greatest updates, is that we have some nice branding when you land on the front page, which is always a good start. But just for the benefit of anyone who is new to Archers for HERs or for Greater London's use of it, just a quick bit of background. So as I say, Keystone's the project name that we used for Greater London's implementation of Archers for HERs, which is something that we've been developing for a long while now in collaboration with the GCI and with Farallon Geographic and the City of Lincoln. We've been live as of late summer, early autumn 2022 internally. We've been using it in-house as our live HR service, and our colleagues in giving archaeological advice have been using it for that long, but we are now just about on the brink of sharing it with some limited external partners to start testing out some of the more recent changes that allow sort of external user groups to be set up, and testing some of the permissions there with what they can and can't see, and also just to get a bit more user feedback from a few trusted partners outside the organisation for how it functions for their uses and things like conservation officers, academic users, local societies, and that sort of thing. And then the idea is that there'll be a full public release in late this year, early next year, which will be of the Archers for HERs package as a whole, as well as just for the fully functioning public version of the Greater London version of it. We are currently on Arches 6.1.1. The reason for that is that there is an ongoing project as part of our update to Arches version 7, where we're collaborating with Farallon to incorporate the aforementioned accessibility changes, which will make us compliant with the WCAG guidelines on accessibility for online applications, more on which we'll be hearing from Paul and Chantelle later. So there's a couple of key features for those of you, again, as I say, who are not familiar or weren't at the last user group or haven't seen what we've been doing thus far. So one of the main things that differentiates Arches for HERs from any other Arches implementation, firstly, there are these consultations workflows that were developed for us largely by Farallon, but with some of our own input as well in some areas. So there's this sort of workflow front end that allows for a slightly different approach to inputting data for this sort of casework style data entry, as well as just recording from a HER perspective. This is more for our colleagues offering archaeological advice and working through the planning system, but I'm sure there'd be other applications of this as well that others would be interested in using. It sort of splits what used to be the old HBSMR consultation system into two initially. So there's application areas and consultations, and this means you avoid having a big fat stack of polygons where you've had multiple consultations on the same site. It now means that you can just have one geographic application area, and then you can have a one-to-many relationship with lots of consultations on that same site, which are all then related back to the application area. And then using this same workflow system, you can also add the communication and site visit cards to the consultation model. So you can record conversations that you've had about that particular site or that particular application. They can record things that have happened on site visits, like photographs, and how that's impacted on the advice that's been given. And then finally, you can generate a letter that will give the official guidance, official notes on what planning advice has been given for that particular consultation. So that's just an example of the consultation workflow without me having to go through the whole thing. We're just bouncing through this in screenshots to save time. So that's just showing that just through the consultation workflow, application areas appear as a feature layer within that workflow, so that you can create that spatial relationship within the workflow of consultations. Then once consultations have been created, there's this active consultation screen, which previews all of the current active consultations. You can sort them by target date or logged date. You can search by whose casework it is, and there's a traffic light system for how close it is to being due. And then finally, this is just how you would generate the letter using the correspondence workflow. And there's been some recent changes made to a lot of those letters so that they're more consistent in their formatting and the sort of boilerplate text that comes in. But obviously that'll be customizable to anyone else who wants to implement it. The other key feature, which has already been alluded to earlier this afternoon, we have, again, Farallon helped with this, got an Arc Pro direct link up, which I've got a quick screenshot here, but I might, and this is very dangerous ground I'm treading here, but I might be able to quickly live demo something because I did set something up earlier. So let me just, can we see Arc Pro here? We all good? Just make sure my connection's still running. Should be.
Yes, it's showing.
Good. So you can use the Arches connection to either edit or create resources, and then you can also open up the Arches browser interface. Currently it's in Chromium. We might be changing to a different service for that in future, but that's what we're at for now. So this one is currently a point geometry. I want to update it to a polygon, so I'm going to select that, click register feature with Arches. It should recognize that that's an activity and find the resource instance ID. I'm going to edit the resource. I'm already in edit resources. If I switch back to my contents, I'm going to turn on this working layer that I have in Arc Pro. I'm going to clear my current selection and select that polygon instead. Go back to edit resources. It's still remembered that that's what I've selected, but now I can upload this geometry and I can say that I want to replace the existing one. It gives me a little notification to ask if I'm definitely sure that I want to submit that polygon. I'll click OK, and then hopefully you can click this button down here for edit using Arch's resource editor. Ah, that's crashed my Arc Pro. Marvelous. That's what happens in live demos. But let's see if I can. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find that now. Oh well, never mind. Such is life. But yes, that should theoretically take you through to the Chromium plugin and allow you to see that that resource has had its geometry changed. So apologies that's Arc Pro being unstable, I think, rather than the plugin, unfortunately. But never mind. So there's some new features as of the latest couple of updates. So these will be new to everybody. We've got British National Grid search feature, which again, this is just a quick screenshot of it. There's not a lot to show off, but it is very handy for us in the HER because the vast majority of our day-to-day work is dealing with inquiries that just allow us to just ask us to put a buffer around a British National Grid centre point. And obviously out the box Arches deals entirely in latitude, longitude. So again, if I just switch to Arches, I should already have British National Grid reference saved there. So I'll put that in 12-figure format. It automatically populates the X and Y 6-digit format as well. And then if I want to say that I've got, no, not 5,500 meters around that point, you can see it's sort of got a mini preview map of what the buffer is in here. But then it also has already given me my search results. This is a saved search that I've already got set up for what we normally send out with our HER results. So if all of the resources that you want to send out as part of a HER search are already set up as a saved search, and then you can just do the British National Grid filter and then do an export, we can theoretically get quite a lot of our HER searches turned around within a matter of 5 to 10 minutes. Which is obviously brilliant for our productivity. Then if we return to the presentation, one of the other new features is that we've now split out the overlays using spatial views as well as just the standard geospatial coordinates thing that comes with the overlays for each resource instance. So for monuments, we've now, and for areas, we've managed to split it out so that as well as displaying all monuments, you can now only display designated monuments. So that's anything that has something entered into the branch for designation and protection assignments. So just to show that quickly, you can see there that with both of those layers turned on, we've then got some points, we've got all points in green, but then those grey ones are only those that have been given a designation of being a listed building. So you can now see those separately or together and compare and contrast quickly and visually. And then finally, one of the other key features that's been updated for our purposes. So with the way that we've done consultations, the relationship between application areas and consultations, like everything in Arches from version 6 onwards, that relationship is sort of created in one direction, but then the only way you can see it back in the other direction is through the old related resources view, which in and of itself is a kind of relic of Arches 5 and older. So that reciprocity and making it more easily visible was something that was quite important to us, especially as of the directionality with the application and consultation area relationship. It's actually created in one direction, but more important to be able to see it in the other direction. So when you create a consultation, you relate it back to the application area, but it's actually more useful to be able to look at an application area and see all the consultations. So what Chantelle and co and Andy and our colleagues there have created is this lovely report view in report mode, and we'll hear more about the reports themselves from Chantelle momentarily. But we've got in associated resources this section titled Resource Referenced By, which can show you any resources that have been related back to this one in the other direction. And then there is also a column for the type. So theoretically, at the moment, this is only present for this application area consultation relationship, but in future, this could be extended to be in the report view for all resources, so that that reciprocity is future-proofed against the possibility of that visualization of related resources. That's, as I say, a kind of a relic of older versions of Arches. If that ever gets deprecated or sunsetted, then this kind of future-proofs against that and keeps that possibility of showing that relationship in both directions. So that's going to be quite useful going forward as well. And there are just a couple of other little features that I just wanted to summarise before I move across to Paul and Chantelle. There's some changes that have been made to the permissions. As I said, we are going to be having a limited external launch, and then in future the big public launch. So there's a few changes that's been made to some of the user groups about what they can and can't see, particularly with regard to that consultation data, but also that they can't link through where those things have been related from the models that they can see. So if there is a related consultation from an activity, for example, making sure that they can't click through and get to that information via another route other than just the search page. And as I say, there's also been a few little refinements to the consultation letters. But for a more technical summary of a lot of the more recent changes, I'm going to end my presentation there, and we'll move on to whichever Paul and Chantelle wants to go next. So moving on.
Shall I go next, Paul? Save the accessibility fun for the last. I can't hear you, you're muted. I'm assuming that's a yes, though.
So
yes, I'm going to take it.
Go for it.
Excellent. Right. So I'm just going to share that. Can everyone see that? I can't see people, so I'm assuming excellent. Right. So hello, I'm Chantelle Smith. I'm senior software developer at Historic England. I'm part of Andy Jones's team, and Paul is one of my colleagues, along with Kingsley Hodgkinson and Rob Oates. And we've been customizing and extending Arches for most of us for quite some time. And Keystone has been the latest thing we've been working on. So I'm really going to talk about what customizations we've made specifically for Arches for HER and Keystone, but some of that has been building on previous projects as well. So we've been doing a lot of extensions. So we've got a data type widget, several functions, and as Matt showed, the BNG search filter. That's been a lot of what I've been focusing on, has been those extensions. We've been looking at bulk HTML reports through the functionality that has been coded in by Farallon, but we've been extending those to fulfill the requirements of the users for Keystone. We've also been extending and customizing the kind of single view report views, which is what Matt showed earlier. Farallon had done a vast amount of it, but then there were some things that came up later on once the users started having a look at how things were, and we just had to kind of tinker with those a bit. We've worked on putting restrictions in for export results, and also viewing map layers, because we know that this is going out to the public. So we want to have a little more control over who can do what. We've been one of the things we've been looking at is branding. So Paul, who will be speaking after me, is the front end developer and has been doing a lot of branding related exercises with Keystone. But I've been working on sort of the end point of branding our email communications, so using the templates that come out of the box with Arches and extending those so that we can have our own branding and information on them. We've used spatial views to create custom overlays, as Matt showed, to enhance how we look at the data and split out sort of certain elements within that have certain information within the resource. And we've been making small other changes as well. For example, we wanted to link to help documentation that one of the team who trains and does the documentation had created. So we didn't want to use the out-of-the-box help. So we've just kind of changed the base manager a little bit to allow us to point to our own help documentation. So just to give you an overview on the extensions that we've worked on, Andy created the BNG filter because most of the information that comes in and requests are based on British National Grid. So just to make it a bit easier to see whereabouts you're looking for your results. I don't have the map background there. I don't quite know what happened, but as you can see the buffer around the point is digitized as well, so you get a fairly good idea of where you're looking at. The BNG data type and widget originally came out of a previous project called Warden, but there has so basically what it does is you can record a center point with for your resource, and you can enter it in either as alphanumeric, British National Grid, absolute British National Grid, or lat long, and depending on which option you choose, it will transform that information or that coordinate into an alphanumeric British National Grid value. What's come up for us new in Keystone has been making it available to search in the advanced search. It is, however, handled as a string, so you have to kind of treat it like a string rather than putting in just the 100-kilometer letters and then a couple of the numbers, and you can't expect it to understand that it should be padding things out or expecting within to narrow down the values, as it were. So I don't know if we want to extend that at some point to make it a bit smarter, but that's how things stand as they are at the moment. We've created quite a few functions to make things a bit easier for the end user. So we have two functions that kind of work in tandem. So it's the BNG point to GeoJSON and GeoJSON to BNG point, which basically means you can put in a national grid reference in a BNG data type, and it will trigger the function and it will create a point in a GeoJSON node, feature collection node. And conversely, if you change some of the geometry, it will then recalculate the center point and populate the BNG data type node. So those two work together. We have a couple of versions of the generate unique references. So this will create, rather than having a UUID, it will create a unique reference number that's probably easier for users to use on a day-to-day basis without overwriting the node, the reference instance ID. So resource instance ID. We have a function that takes the point, the GeoJSON, and works out related areas against a web service. And we're currently working on that to try and make it more generic. So kind of create a scaffolding so that we can then put that out to the community to use. We found that we needed a function that would append the unique reference ID internal one rather than the UUID to a name of a resource. So we've had to create a new I can't remember what the actual function is called, the primary descriptor function to stick those two together. So we've got our own function for that. And we have created a function that allows you to take nodes within a card and choose which ones you want, and then populate another node within that card with the information there. So for this example, we've taken addresses. So in order to create the full address, we have certain nodes that are put together and are used to populate that full address node. So that's the functions. These will all be available. They're at 6.1 at the moment, but we've got a body of work to get them up to version 7, and they will be available on our GitHub repository for other people to use. So another thing that we've extended has been creating custom reports for our bulk export options. So if you go to search export, you've got your selection. You select HTML and it generates something that's a bit like this. So it's branded and it's been made accessible for our templates. As you can see up here, it's a bit codey. You do need a developer to create the template that's that the values get injected into. So it is a bit fiddly, but it works well, and it is customizable. We also applied an export limit so that if you've got fewer than 10 results, you can get a direct download. If it's more than that, it gets pushed off to to Celery, which manages the task manager, and that can run in the background and send you an email and a notification once it's done, so it doesn't stop you from continuing to work on what you're working on. If we go to the resource reports, as Matt was saying, we've got a couple of things that have been changed to make these more tailored to what we want. At version Arches 6, there was this ability to have these tabs. So rather than those of you will know kind of version 5 and backwards, and even out of the box now, you would get the report that was just kind of a long single page of all the information, all the nodes, and that wasn't particularly helpful always to be able to flick through all the data. So these new reports have been created mostly by Farallon. They've got, so you can tab through them based on, I think it's basically groupings of cards, and it just makes it a bit easier to read through the reports. As Matt said, we created certain bits that allow you to look backwards at how things are related. At the moment, it's just consultations related to application areas, but it is written to allow you to choose which model, which graphs you want to see that are related to the resource you're looking at the moment. So it is very flexible in how that bit works. Yeah, so we've also been looking at how we restrict things, as I said, because it's going public eventually. We want to have a bit of control as to who can do what and who can see certain information. So there's out of the box restrictions like permissions on graphs, but this is functionality based. So as you can see here, I've got screenshots of 2 different user accounts. So this is my main one where I have access to, I've been put in the search exporters group. So I get this button allowing me to export my search results. But in my test one, I'm not part of that group, and that functionality is completely taken away. So there's no way to kind of get round being able to export things you're not supposed to be able to export. And that is for those of you who see and know the kind of code side of Arches, that's all set up and configured in the settings local .py form. We've also got the ability to restrict map access. So these are on the map layers, and we've got functionality so that you go into your choice of map layers, you select your map layer, and then there's this new button called Object Permissions. And then you can choose if there's a group, what they can do. So we've got for people who are external users, they can't access that map layer, so it won't come up in the overlays or the base maps that are in the user interface. As I said, we've got email branding, so you don't have the out of the box, it all comes out pretty much just text-based, but you can add HTML files to your sort of Arch's code. What we've done is split it out, so you've got a header, you've got your footer, so they can be kept consistent across all of your emails, and then they're basically injected in or included in, and then you've got your actual text that's based on, you know, whether it's a search export, whether it's a password change, whether it's a profile change, so that you only have to change things that are consistent once, but then you can have much more flexibility with the purpose for the email. Spatial views, hopefully I'm not going too quickly. So with spatial views in Arches, it's preview only, so you can't, it's not to do with editing. This is all generated from what's in the database already. It allows you to create a subset, so hopefully to enhance your understanding of the data. It's created directly in the PostGIS database, so you run a SQL command to generate the spatial views. We then make them available using PG FeatureServe or PG TileServe. That's not the only way to do it, but that's the way that we're doing it. And then we take that feature service or tile service endpoint, and we reference it in the map source configuration in the Django admin interface, which comes as part of Arches. And we also put a filtering. So for this, we've filtered on the designation types, and we've basically added that filtering onto the endpoint. And we've also got spatial views that are used in ArcPro, as Matt was showing earlier. Right, this is one of the last slides. We've got some other customizations that are kind of quite small, so I haven't given them a whole slide to themselves. Although the letters parts of the workflow were mostly created by Farallon, we did need to make some adjustments based on feedback from the users within GLHER, so that took a little bit of time, but we got there in the end. As I said, we have changed how we do help, so we've basically replaced the icon, and it goes off to an external site. But it does look at what group the user is in to decide which URL. There are two URLs, so it decides that way which URL to send them off to. We've also, because of our legal obligations, we have had to include links to terms and conditions, privacy and accessibility notices. So they've been added into the left-hand column on our Keystone, and similarly we were asked for a link back to the home page, so we've added one of those. So I think that's it. We publish our code to fulfill the requirements of our licensing with Getty and Arches. So that's our URL, github.com Historic England. And we're also active on the Arches project forum. So if you have any questions or you want to discuss anything, just kind of give one of us a nudge on there, and I'm sure myself and my colleagues will be happy to have a chat with you. So that's me. I'm going to hand over to Paul now.
Thank you very much, Chantelle. Right, I will try and share my screen. There it is. Okay, can everybody see that and hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you very much. It's a bit short and sweet, this PowerPoint bit, because I was going to include a load of sort of before and after screenshots of accessibility work I've done, but it's if it works, it'd be nice to actually show you rather than, and probably easier to show you rather than look at some screenshots. So I'm just going to cover things like, obviously this is to do with web accessibility. What is it? Why do we need it? And basically my experience with working on arches and trying to make it accessible. So what is it and why do we need it? Yep, so make all websites accessible. Regarding websites and other systems, I mean things like, you know, Windows applications or whatnot. It's just a way of designing and presenting web page content or other content so that people with disabilities can use and navigate through the pages and the content. It's basically, it's a common goal to make everything as accessible as possible. So one of those things is to be as inclusive as possible. So basically there's lots of people with disabilities and impairments all over the world. At least 1 in 5 people in the UK have a long-term illness or an impairment, visual impairment or disability. Many more have temporary sort of disabilities, maybe caused by accident or whatever. Such disabilities that affect the use of using a website can include auditory, cognitive, you know, making things understandable as possible, perhaps not to just display an icon, try and be a bit more helpful, neurological, physical, speech and visual. It's also important to mention that a website should be designed to enable the user to use devices with much smaller screen space, such as mobiles or tablets. Website content should still be navigable and readable on smaller screens. For example, someone with impaired vision might use a screen reader. We've been using some software called NVDA. It's free. You can install it, and it's incredibly annoying when you switch it on. If you're not used to it, it does read out everything, or it tries to. So basically, yeah, it reads out the content displayed on the screen. There are braille displays. There's screen magnifying software. But for somebody who may have motor difficulties, you know, they might be using a special mouse or not a mouse, just a keyboard, so they can't, you know, they won't be able to click on things. They have to use the tab button, either the enter or the space, to actually mimic the left mouse click. And also, you know, there's things like on-screen keyboard emulators, all that sort of thing. But there's a whole host of things. In the UK, it's law, and basically we need to adhere to some guidelines, and it's acronymed WCAG. And the accessibility regulations came into force for public sector bodies on September the 23rd, 2018, where people should be making their websites accessible to at least level A standard. There's 3 levels. I'll explain those in a minute. So yeah, so we're working actually here at HER. We're trying to achieve AA and AAA in some cases. So level A is like the minimum acceptable conformance. AA is better conformance, and AAA is highest level of conformance. When I say things like we're trying to go for AAA if we can, it's just for simple things like if you can imagine a button, the contrast between the background color of the button and the text on the button need to be sufficient enough. It's very easy to change colors using the style sheets and everything. So if we can make it AAA, why not? Let's do it. future-proof ourselves. So yeah, basically the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, was created by the W3C, warning, lots of acronyms, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. So in short, really, the WCAG, all those guidelines, are an organised list of rules that should be adhered to one of the levels. So basically, yeah, I mean, it might be worth noting that I think we're currently working with version 2.1 of WCAG, but there are newer versions being worked on, which obviously when they come into play, we will have to adhere to those too whenever they're published. I don't know any dates on that. I've took a quote. There's a government website. I've took a quote of it, so I'm just going to read it out. It says, organisations that do not meet the accessibility requirement or fail to provide a satisfactory response to a request to produce information in an accessible format will be failing to make reasonable adjustments. This means they will be in breach of the Equality Act 2010 and the Disability Discrimination Act 1995. So it's quite important, really, that we do this. And I've got some examples. And here I was going to do the screenshots, but I'm going to attempt somehow or another. How do you switch flipping? How the hell do you switch from what you're presenting? That's what I want to know. Just bear with me a second. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that and I'll share another window. Just bear with me a second. Okay, can you see the website?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yes, this is a website at the moment on stage. You won't be able to access this because it's not there yet. So basically what I was going to do was show you a few examples of what I've done. So if, using the Chrome web browser, I mean, other browsers have it as well. But so if you just flick that into mobile view, it's just mimicking the width and height of the Samsung Galaxy Ultra, as you can see there, but there are other obviously sizes you can go to. And let me do it on this is Arch. This is from the Arch's demo. So obviously bear in mind this might be a few versions behind. So a few things might have been improved already. But as you can see, where's the map gone? I can't see the map. I can't even scroll down to it. I can't get to it. It's totally gone. The left menus disappeared. There's all sorts of scrolling going on, different scroll bars, all sorts of things, wonderful things. So what I've tried to do is, obviously we can put a lot of media queries in. I won't go into the technicalities, but it'll probably bore everybody. But so certain screen widths you can detect. So for example, what happens now is it stacks on top of each other. So we've got the order was search results and then map. So when it stacks on top of each other instead of left to right, so it goes from left to right to top to bottom. So you've got the results on the top, and then if you keep scrolling down, which people are well used to on mobile devices, by scrolling, there you can see your map. So you can still get to everything. You know, there's a menu there. I'm not logged in, so it's not showing anything. You can still see things, and you can still get to your filters and advanced searched and all the rest of it. Whereas what we did have was pretty abysmal. You couldn't do it basically. So that was the mobile issue we've kind of addressed. Color contrast. Now that's an interesting one, really. So you can see, for an example, that resource type button. It does not pass accessibility checks, contrast issue checks. Now, what you can do is to aid your development is install some Wave plugin. Install some different plugins. One of them is called Wave. What was the other one called? Arc Toolkit. Now, it basically you load the page you want to check, and you press on the icon up there, plugin icon, and it gives you a little results. I'm not going to click on it because sometimes it takes a little while to do, but you can identify bits and pieces on the page, contrast, errors, all that sort of thing. This text and these links, they will fail as well. So on here, you can see I've made the background darker, so the foreground text displays with more contrast, and the same for the text and everything. You can check. There are lots of websites around that do this to help. But for example, on this demo, the color of that button there, I know it was that, and the foreground was white. So there you go. That's it demoed there, and you can see all the levels failing, which is not what you want. So it's up to you, I suppose at the end of the day, what color buttons you like. And I'm working on some things that might help with theming different things. But you can see when I move this slider to make the blue darker, these fails start to become passes, which is obviously what we want. And if you want AAA, you've got to be quite dark, to be honest. But it all passes. So there you go. That's what color I'll use if I want to be accessible. Tabbing, yeah, tabbing was another thing, wasn't it? So clicking anywhere, if you tab, now I know that probably be on the login button, but how do you know? How do you know you're there? Can't even tell. And if you keep tabbing, oh, there you go, it's gone in the search field, and then it's going down to the search results, but it's not going on the title. It's making the title a little bit darker, but it's not very brilliant. So what we've done is try to improve that a lot. So if I click on there at the top and then tab, you can see now it's underlined and it's got a border around it, which easily tells you where you are on the page. And you can just tab around and you can see the tab position moving. Some of these things I found on here, some of these are simple links, so you can just press the enter key on it and it will open. But certain things, like some of these buttons and some of the items in here, for example, in the advanced search, whatever, aren't simple links. There are other containing HTML things like divs or whatever. You can't tab to a div unless you tell it to. So it's all to do with making it, imagine you haven't got to use of your mouse, you need to use your keyboard. So if you can't tab to it, you've got to make it so you can tab to it. And the other thing I was going to show you quickly was zooming. So again, if I click somewhere in there just to give it focus and then press on my keyboard, Control+, you'll see all the content getting bigger, which obviously some people may want to make use of. And as you can see what's happened there, it gets to a certain amount of screen width available and it starts its stacking, which eventually when you get to mobile, smaller views, you then have to do the big scrolly bit. But at least it's there, and at least you can still see it and navigate it. Whereas what used to happen was you would press Control plus on this, and you could see what's starting to happen. Things start overlapping and being on top of other things. Oh, now I've lost my search box. Oh God! And then oh, the whole menu's gone now. Where's that gone? And then oh, where's the map? I mean, you know, so that's what we're trying to do. All these guidelines are incredibly exhaustive, I have to say, and I'm not going to go through them all here, but here they all are. If you ever need to check anything or test against it, we've got some good accessibility testers that produce reports, and then we can create work tickets from it and work on it and make sure it's all good. So that's what we're doing. There's also this I found on the W3C website. It's just about it's all about what is it. Some of it's what I've said already, but it goes into a lot more depth, and there's a short video and everything. But that's from the government. So now I'm going to go back. Excuse me a moment. Mr. Stop Presenting button. There you go. Stop sharing. I'll go back to that and onto that. There's probably an easier way of switching, isn't there? Anyway, so next page. No, it's still zooming. Why is it zooming? Gosh, it's well slick. See. So my conclusion was basically there's a lot of ongoing work to make things even more accessible than it is now. We've got quite a lot of tickets that have been worked on over the years. I have been working on this for years. It's kind of, well, what shall I say? It's kind of been the bane of my life, but I'm not complaining because it's my job, and I love it. But every time an Archie's version comes out, we've had to make sure all my accessibility changes are reflected in the new version. And guess what? No, it doesn't work. So it does for some of it it doesn't, if they've changed anything in the background to do with the web page layouts, class names, all that sort of stuff. So what we're doing now is a lot of collaborative work with Parallon, and we're working together on version 7 to make the core version have all this accessibility in place. So when you get your branches and build your code, whatever, hopefully in the future it'll all be accessible. And then when we have an upgrade, all these things will be taken into account when they do their development. So that's what the hope is. And then that will obviously minimize the rework. And also, because all this is collaborative and it's open source. Arches is open source, so we're giving it back to the open source community. So hopefully, eventually, we'll all be accessible wherever we are. But if you want to use bright red buttons with purple text, it's completely up to you. But it may not pass accessibility. I know some countries don't have accessibility laws yet, but obviously that may change in the future. So yeah, that's me really. Any questions? I think is it over to Andy? Do you want to say anything? No. Okay, back to the chair then.
Well, thanks very much. That was I've raised my hand. That was a mistake. I meant to applaud. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
Consider yourself applauded.
Thank you.
How do I take it down again, though? That seems.
Yeah, you've managed it. It's
I've
gone.
done it. Oh, fantastic. That's grand. Well, thank you all so much for that. It's just remarkable to see how much work you're putting into the Keystone instance. But I think the thing that perhaps you know, if you'll take a moment of criticism, you could have sort of said a little bit more about is just how valuable this work that you're doing is to the much wider UK historic environment record community. You know, I mean, we all have very high hopes that that other organisations are going to pick up Archers and run with it, and I think for them to be able to do so, the work that you've all been doing, and perhaps I may say especially Paul, you've been doing, is going to be absolutely crucial to that. And from the Lincoln side of things, we went live in May 2018, which put us just on the right side of the accessibility requirement, but that's not a situation that can obtain forever. So I'm personally very much looking forward to the launch of Archers at HER, so that we can upgrade to that and actually then join the accessibility party in that regard, because it is it's a very important duty for us as a public body. So thanks very much for all that. Does anyone else have any questions? I'd be very surprised if you didn't, because there was an awful lot of ground covered there. Azadeh, yes, please.
Yes, my question is to Matt about the plugin, the Arc, not a plugin, how do you name it? Link up. Is that, so you showed kind of that we can edit the geometry and replace the geometry. Would the same thing work with the attributes side of the things?
Not sure you can pipe attribute tables from Arc Pro into nodes, but what you can do is directly open an Arches instance in that little browser, Chromium, the thing that I was trying to open when it crashed. So once you've either created or edited the geometry in Arc Pro, if you can then essentially open a browser window that's contained within Arc Pro but is just Arches directly within Arc Pro, so you can start editing the record that you've just created or edited within your Arc Pro window. So you theoretically you needn't open Arches separately in a browser at all. You could create the geometry. If you were creating records from scratch, you could take a sort of geometry first approach, create the entire instance using the polygon you've just drawn, and then populate the Arches record through the standard resource editor interface, but as a pop-up within Arc Pro. But I don't think you can populate the resource editor through the attribute table of a shapefile. I'm not sure that's possible now.
Okay, thank you.
It's not. I think no. The complexity, I think you probably discovered around actually being able to convert human readable text to some of the Arches, kind of UUID, the concepts, and some of the other things. I think that is quite a complex thing that at the moment they've not done. It's just the geometry editing.
Thanks. And kind of say from Chantelle, the extensions and everything that you were showing, they're amazing, and we're kind of hopeful that with the codes available, we can pick and choose and try to implement on our versions as well.
Yeah,
we have to try and see how that would work.
Yeah, we'll try and get those up as soon as possible so that we can, because we know that they would be useful to other people. But I'm glad that you can see the potential in them for your project.
Thanks.
I have a couple of questions. So yeah, that was really interesting. Yeah, very exciting. So I guess I'll try and keep it brief, but first one was on the accessibility work. That's really brilliant. I think also even just in terms of general usability on smaller screens it's also really powerful as well. We've been looking a little bit about expanding some of our Cypress testing. I'm wondering if there's possibility to overlap in some of that, so automated front-end tests in CI. I'm wondering, just you mentioned about that retesting process, if that might make that a little easier. But yeah, so if there's any thoughts on that, I don't know. I'll start with that one.
We've so the testing that we've got a test team that does a combination of tests. I know they have written quite a lot of Cypress tests specifically for the GLHER, which / Keystone application. We've got kind of a couple of names for it. So they have put together their own Cypress tests, which I guess it would be good to kind of make them part of it. We don't use CI as part of that test pipeline at the moment because our test team is where they currently are. So I'm sure that's something that they want to do. But obviously, if we could have a more generic set of tests, that'd be good. I guess one of the things is we just got, because we have quite a few customizations in there at the moment. Having it across the board for all Arches instances would make things a little bit complicated. So it could be that there are Cypress test packages per project, possibly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, at the moment we spotted there were a couple of parallel ones that we pulled into our CI just to test the CI, ironically. But yeah, that would certainly be interesting. Another one, we're kind of we've been working with a mixture of BNG and ING, so our data sets vary, which as I'm sure John can identify is sometimes a little challenging. One question I did have was, do you have ways of keeping the grid references reconciled with the geospatial when it's stored, or is it just kind of, okay, we're taking it in and we're translating it and storing both? What happens if one gets updated, or is that a realistic concern?
Well, that's where we've got those functions between the BNG and the GeoJSON. So basically, if one of them's updated, then it will automatically trigger an update of the other one.
Okay.
So, and it works, both ways basically. So that there are ways they're correct on both ways.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So it's basically whichever way you edit it, it'll update both.
Yes.
Okay, I got you. Cool.
There are some nuances around what the complexity of the GeoJSON is, though, because obviously one, if you go start from the map reference side of things, it'll create a point. But if you then go and digitize a load of features in the GeoJSON node, it then just works with the extent of those features. So the center point of the extent, and so it doesn't try and kind of keep track of a single point somewhere in that node.
Yeah, so it's not too many BNG polygon type situations put that way. Okay. And last one for me briefly is reverse relationships. That looks great. I really like that. I want to use it. Is that I'd not spotted it, but is that something that is usable and testable, or was there a little while to...
So it's a scene. It's a report scene.
Okay.
And then you kind of you put the name of the kind of where you're reversing to in the main report sort of config for that theme. But I'm happy to chat and show you through things offline if that would be helpful.
Okay, that's good. I probably feel a bit guilty, but thank you. No, that was really good. Thanks, very much.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, I'm conscious that we are we're actually getting not very far from the end of the meeting, which is we're meant to be finishing at 3:30, and we have still got quite a lot to get through. To that end, I think I'm tempted to, if nobody disagrees wholeheartedly, to bump my very brief presentation about the consultation module until our next meeting. Because I think it's probably a little more important that we hear from Maggie, given that she's, I think, got up very early in the morning to speak to us today. Does anyone object to that? No? Marvellous.
No.
That saves you from hearing too much more from me anyway. Right, so that being the case, thank you very much, Historic England colleagues. That was really helpful. And now I think we'll pass over to Maggie. Maggie, thanks so much for joining us. What must be a very early time of the morning for you.
Hi, yes, it is a little early on a Monday, but really happy to join and see everything that everyone's up to. I would also be interested in that reverse relationship In reports, we're doing a lot in San Francisco, which is where I work. So I work in San Francisco, California, for the San Francisco Planning Department. And we've been working on our implementation for several years now, but I'm really here on behalf of the Arches US user group. And I can speak a little bit about it. I don't have a formal presentation or anything. I can drop in some links to our, we have Google Drive, we keep many minutes. We have sort of some resource lists that we've been gathering, but I'm really happy to answer any questions. I also don't want to take away from another presentation, so yeah, whatever works out for you all.
Well, perhaps Maggie, if you could just sort of talk us through the makeup of the group, you know, whether how formally you're constituted, for example, what your membership is like, and you know, some of the sort of how frequently you meet, things of that nature, because I think we're still. We've been thinking for quite some time, and there is an item on the agenda of development of the Archers UK user group. We've been sort of thinking for some time about how we put our group on a more formal basis, and I think taking a pre-existing model, well, and that's pretty much the be-all and end-all of the Archers community, isn't it? So yeah, if you can talk to us a bit more about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, happy to do that. Okay, so we started, we just kind of started off this way, which I think was pretty helpful. So we meet every other month, and we meet, I think, for just 1 hour during lunchtime, and it's usually the third or fourth Thursday, or sorry, it's the first or second Thursday of the month, and so it's just kind of a standard recurring meeting, and it is only 1 hour. I think usually by the end of the hour, we're like, we really wish we could keep going. So it is, I really appreciate having like the nice long presentations and like the nice time for Q&A. I think because it is only an hour, it allows us to like, okay, we'll see you in 2 months. And because we have the recurring, I think that really helps. We have, I think about 30 to 40 people that have come through. I'd say that there are maybe around 20 that are, maybe 15 to 20 that are pretty regular attendees. And from all different parts of the United States and all different stages of Arches implementation. We have LA, which was one of the first organizations to implement Arches. And then we've got others that are just interested. Sometimes students or those that are fresh out of school join, just interested in Arches and sort of what we're talking about as a group. And then we've got the developers, so Farallon joins, and then we've also got those that are actually using Arches on a day-to-day basis for their city or for their organization. So I think we've got a nonprofit organization and then a couple of them, and then we've got public agencies such as San Francisco Planning Department or other planning related sort of departments on the public side. And I think that there are also some consultants and people that are on the academic side. So really just kind of all over, people who are using Arches in the US or interested in it. And we do kind of a share. We have a sort of a standard agenda. We do a welcome. If someone is new, we have them new to the group, we have them introduce themselves. And we've got kind of like a member list. And then we go into sort of the content of the meeting, which we try to figure that out the meeting before, or we sort of try to, sometimes it's like, what is most relevant? We had a great accessibility conversation 2 conversations ago, and then we've also talked about funding and resources. That's been very helpful for us. And then about sort of the progress of collector, Arches collector, and then versus workflow. So lots of different conversations, some instance sharing as well. So it's yeah, it's really what people are interested in talking about. And then we wrap it up, Q&A, and then we by the end of the meeting, we just set the next date for the following meeting so that we're like, okay, we can put it on our calendars, and then I send the invite out. So I think that helps it keep it regular, but it's also sort of the agreed upon. We had all sort of agreed on it in the first meeting. So maybe that helps. Maybe to answer any other questions.
Hi, Maggie. What's the kind of makeup? Is it sort of, do you have many devs, like developers, come along, or is it mostly just kind of users, like end users?
I would say that there are a fair amount of devs. Like a lot of the Farallon team joins, and then there are several other developers that join as well. And I would say that is probably one of the most helpful aspects of the user group, because we, on the public user side, from us to be able to say, well, is this possible? And then a developer to come in like right away and say, yes or no, or like, let me think, like, that's a really great suggestion. Let me think about it. And then they've also been able to talk a couple of times about the roadmap development. So maybe in conversation, we're saying, some of the public agencies or, those that are using and implementing Arches, they're saying also start going down a rabbit hole of like, okay, this is a problem and this is a problem. And then the developers are like, okay, we're addressing that like this way and this way. And so that's been really great.
Cool. Thank you.
Maggie, could you just ask, and well, first of all, thank you for coming along so early in the morning again. I really appreciate it. Do you get from the meetings any sort of momentum for collaboration between different users about developing new ideas for taking Arches forward?
Yeah, I think that after the grant and sort of resources discussion, I definitely felt like a lot of inspiration around collaborating more. And there was a thought about like, maybe we apply as a user group to a grant or something like that. Nothing has really happened with that so far, but I think getting the conversation started is really helpful. So so that's where we are with that. It's hard because we're all like so busy trying to do our own implementations, and then to come back to the larger group, but at least being able to sort of share our progress. I think that probably at least I think the collector, understanding how Arches collector kind of hasn't really worked out, and San Francisco's experience with that, we were like more than happy to share that with everyone, and then our sort of troubleshooting through that and what we're doing now, which is using workflows for our in-field survey. So I think that as we go through step with step, and especially with accessibility, I think that there's definitely a lot of room for collaboration and continuing those conversations.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Can't hear you, Mac.
Oh, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Do you know what it was? I thought I was muted and I was pressing the space bar and I was actually muting myself while I was speaking to you. Which anyway, I think what I was saying is I think it would be actually very useful, Maggie, if we could and I realise it's committing one or other of us to an early morning or a late evening, but I think that the sort of having a continued relationship between the UK group and the US group could potentially also be very useful indeed. And I think once we've sort of more formalised things at our end, we could sort of perhaps have a rotating system of volunteers to join you and perhaps vice versa. So I think that would be very useful. Has anyone got any other questions for Maggie? No? Okay. Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you. So that's your That's your minutes, I presume, that you've just shared with us there, Maggie. Is that right?
That's just our next meeting. I love the idea of like us circling, like cycling through, and it is really helpful that you all record yours. So yeah, maybe I'm happy to continue joining. You know, if this is a good standing time for everyone, like I think this works well for me. And then I can relay back to our user group and see if others are interested in rotating around. And then yeah, ours I think it's only 8 p.m. your time, so if that's okay.
That's not too late. that should be fine, I'd have thought.
Yeah.
No, that's really helpful. Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Maggie. Okay, so the next thing on the agenda was updates from members of the group. So I think we've heard from several of our colleagues. I'm just wondering if there are any other people working on projects at the moment who maybe want to share things that they've been doing. Am I missing any raised hands? That's okay. Well, shall we skip that item then? Always bear in mind that if you have got anything that you feel you couldn't quite do justice to in a couple of minutes at the end of this meeting, you can always sort of drop us a line and make suggestions for presentations for the next one. That would, I think, be very very helpful. Okay, so moving on to the next item, which was development of the Archers UK user group. So I think, is that one over to you there, Stu?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I was just thinking, I was very interested to hear what Maggie was doing with their group, or our colleagues in North America were doing with their user group, and I was just wondering what the thoughts are of the group here about having more regular meetings. I mean, obviously, it all depends on what work is taking place, and we have been rather ad hoc due to various unforeseen reasons. But I was just wondering whether, as a group, whether we wanted to put the meetings on a more regular footing. Maybe every 3 months or maybe every 2 months. I don't know. I was just wondering what the thoughts are. If anybody's got any thoughts on that.
3 months might be just because of things, it's summer and yeah, that might be a good idea. Looks like the chat is coming through similarly as well.
And are we happy with the kind of the length of the meeting? I mean, I feel we could have gone on possibly a bit longer. But I mean, whether people want, what, I'm not suggesting a whole day. That might be too much. But maybe slightly longer, going on for another hour. So this meeting was 3 hours, so maybe 4 hours, going on to half 4. Or more, or more shorter, John.
Yeah. No, I think another half hour or so. I certainly feel like maybe it's just because we've had so much, and I've certainly realised I waffled on quite a bit. So maybe an extra half hour to make it maybe 3.5.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe it's one of those things we tailor for the presentations. I mean, obviously, not everybody's going to have things rolling out all the time, so that there might be some times where it's a shorter meeting, sometimes it's a slightly longer meeting, and maybe a bit like how we work with the HER forum. We bank talks, so we can think about that. The other thing I was thinking, which I alluded to when I was talking, asking Maggie about what they do, is about more collaborating together as a group. I think there's a strong interest in QGIS as a tool working alongside Arches, and Matt did a brilliant presentation of the ArcGIS Pro link, in spite of Pro's reluctance or shyness. That's something that we feel we find a useful tool, and it's something that I would be interested in looking at as, you know, a QGIS version of that as well. I mean, I can understand, you know, talk to people about this, the importance of having the Esri version of it because of, you know, the use of Esri, various different organizations, but the QGIS to me fits in better with the ethos of Arches. But obviously what I don't think we want is everybody off going and doing their own different version, whether we need to perhaps get a small group together of people who are interested in that and maybe thrash out some ideas. And then once we have a better idea of what we would like and perhaps what is technically possible, then comes the big question of how much does it cost to do this? And I think if we've got more people involved with that, then that might be an easier way of funding that. I mean, certain organizations will have access to, you know, funding streams that other organizations aren't, you know, just can't tap into, but could help in kind. So again, I don't know what people think about that.
We're totally on board to Sue that. And I think Junaid has already talked. Haven't you, Junaid, with a few projects, other projects interested? So, or maybe at least at the start of the talk.
Yeah, we have been discussing this QGIS with different projects, and also in the last Farallon meeting, that was the Arcadia meeting that was in person in London, this was mentioned. So there's definitely room for collaboration to take it forward. Yeah.
We're definitely interested in being that user group or something for QGIS.
I mean, Maggie, is that something that your users would be interested in as well?
I think so, definitely. Again, in the same, you know, thought process as just like Arches in general being open source. So I think that's great. Yeah, and maybe as long if we're having some like a participant from each group in the other group's meetings, that can again help facilitate the collaboration. Like, hey, we're already talking about that, or hey, we're interested in that. So I'm really excited about this.
Well, okay. Perhaps what I'll do is I'll later on, not today, obviously, but I'll send out an email and perhaps get, yeah, if you're interested or you've got colleagues who are interested, just let me know, and then I'll try and set up like another meeting with a doodle poll, and we can start working on that. Great. So yeah, so that's so I've gone off a slight sidetrack there, but I mean, what the other thing I was thinking about is, do people think that we need a more formal structure to the group, sort of terms and conditions, that sort of thing, people that we invite? I know some organizations like that because their staff are involved with that, particularly if at some point we went to a more hybrid meeting. I don't know whether some people would be interested in a more of a face-to-face kind of meeting with some hybrid version going ahead. And I know some organizations, if their staff are involved with this, do like a very regimented or this meeting has set criteria and agenda for it taking forward. Again, I don't know what people think about that.
I like the idea of like doing a face-to-face at some point in the future. And it may well be that it's because you have an annual kind of option of a face-to-face kind of thing, just to kind of meet everyone. and have those kind of conversations, which you often can't have in this kind of forum.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about perhaps, something like that, like an annual opportunity to, get together, have maybe a slightly longer meeting. Sorry, Rebecca.
Yeah, something we've done among the Arcadia projects that we just set up now was a sort of forum similar to this, to discuss the kind of larger scale developments for an interest of the projects. But we've just sent out a sort of simple questionnaire of to give a bit of information about who's in the group, so what your project is. I mean, ours, of course, we're all Arcadia funded, but I wonder if something that would be useful for maybe this group would be, what's your project, what's your funding, who are you funded by, and how long's your funding for, and maybe how many developers you have and who they are. So just we get a bit of a profile of, the skills and the people involved in the group. It might be useful. I can share. We just did it as a Google form, but I can share that as a template if that would be something that might be of interest to sort of have an idea of who's who, and that. I think there's so many ranges of skills and things that people are working on, and perhaps we don't know each other.
Yes, no, that'd be great, Rebecca. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Phil?
Yeah, I think John's mentioned this in the chat as well, but be curious if people are coming over to Belfast for the European Archaeology event. And certainly, I know a couple of people who've involved in this group have mentioned they might be over, and I think some, there might be some socialising in Belfast that occurs at that point. I'm certainly planning on treating it as very convenient. But yeah, if that lines up in terms of timing for something hybrid, we can. I don't know for anybody else in Belfast, but we've got some space at least.
No, thanks. Anything? Oh,
oops, sorry. Yes,
that's
me.
Yeah.
No, I wanted to ask when Maggie was saying that there are fire alarm people involved in their meeting, and I wanted to ask and see how everyone feels here. That if I know with the time difference it will be different, but not all the time at our meetings, but maybe kind of have a specific meeting towards the end of our meeting, ask one or two of their staff to join us kind of for this things that you were saying, Maggie, in a kind of an official way, that people have questions and they just jump in and say, yes, you can do this, no, you cannot do that, or it's in the pipeline of things to do kind of conversation with them. Yes, just a thought if it's something that we can do.
I'm sure they would, because that we meet with them, don't we, Stu, kind of later on in the afternoon. So certainly myself and Paul at the moment we have meetings kind of 5:30, which corresponds with a sensible time of the day, caffeinated part of the day for them. So I'm sure Dennis would be more than happy, or maybe it would be great to get some of the other developers. That sounds like you're fortunate to get over in the States there, Maggie, to have them included as well and kind of go through some of their stuff, because the stuff they do is really good, and I think hearing it from the horse's mouth is often really, really useful.
I agree. Well, we can certainly ask them and see about that, and perhaps again, that could be one of the special occasions where we shift the timing of the meeting a little bit to accommodate their attendance a bit more. I'm conscious that we were slightly over time, so I think I'll pass over to Mac.
So I suppose it's just the last two things are any other business that anyone wants to raise. A very short window. Stu.
I think it's about time we got rid of this blooming secretary. He's rubbish. He's absolutely rubbish. And I think it's time that we need, somebody young and dynamic, and somebody who can really, take this group and move it forward, and help the new wonderful chair who will be taking on, because he's got visions. So so yes, basically, if anybody would be interested in taking over the role of secretary, it's not too arduous. I can just about do it. So I'm sure that the rest of you are more than capable of doing a much better job than I have done so far. So if you'd like to volunteer now, if you've got a burning desire to add that to your CV, or if you'd like to let me know offline, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Okay. And when should we meet again? Date of next meeting. So I think we said quarterly from here on in. So that would take us to July, wouldn't it? Middle of July. We could potentially bring it forward a little bit because that is getting towards the school holidays, isn't it?
I would say early July, I think, just for my own personal benefit.
Okay. So, well, why don't we set up a doodle poll again, but narrow it down to those to that maybe the last week in June, the first week in July, and then see what we can pull out of the bag for that. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. It's been very heartening to see just how many people have. Sorry, I was wrapping up, but somebody put their hand up there. Neil. Griffin, not Smith. Was that a mistaken hand? I'm going to assume it was. Yep. Okay, so thank you all very much for coming, and especially to Maggie for joining us. Well, I mean, you didn't come a long way to join us, but thank you for getting up early to do so. That's much appreciated. And thanks to everyone who gave presentations. They were really very useful, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how Archers develops in the UK over the next 3 months, and hear more from you all then. Okay, thank you all very much indeed. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.